Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, global markets reporter at Nasdaq. Joining me is Ben Jones, senior index specialist with Nasdaq, to discuss inflation fears and the Nasdaq U.S. Price Setters Index. Ben, it's great to see you as always. Welcome back to Trade Talks.
Hey, thank you, Jill.
And of course, Ben, the question is inflation. Are these fears and some of the volatility that we've seen in the market, is it warranted? Are these fears for real?
Yeah. Well, they're certainly in the headlines, right? I think consumers are beginning to take notice of prices at the grocery store. Or anyone who's looking to purchase a new or used car is probably seeing the skyrocketing prices in the auto space. And I think it's safe to say that the inflation fears are real. And just look at some of these headlines that you can see across some of the major news outlets and newspapers and periodicals, right? Where on the Washington Post, recovery stumbles leave Americans confronting unfamiliar inflation risk. The Wall Street Journal earlier last week, the rise in inflation expectations. And of course, with this uncertainty, people are concerned. They don't know what to do. So you see Forbes talking about, should you buy Bitcoin or gold as a potential inflation hedge? And I think it's beginning to hit Wall Street as well. If you look at the Q1 earnings, FactSet did a great job looking at all these different earnings releases and the transcripts, and looking at, let's say, S&P 500 companies, they say 175 of these companies cited that inflation, cited the word inflation in their calls in the first quarter, and that's the highest number that they've seen since 2010. So certainly you're beginning to see it register across Wall Street, and the sectors and industries that are being impacted, consumer staples, you saw a bunch of inflation-cited materials and industrials. You really don't see much from an earnings standpoint of people talking about it in, let's say, healthcare and information technology yet, but maybe that will pick up in Q2.
And tell us about the index here, the Nasdaq U.S. Price Setters Index.
Yeah, so it's an index that I want to bring to your viewers' attention because, for those that are, thinking about, the uncertainty around inflation and looking to, let's say, determine kind of what companies are better positioned to handle what will be kind of an unprecedented scenario, right? We haven't really seen high inflation for, well over a couple decades now. And so the Nasdaq U.S. Price Setters Index is an index that is designed to provide exposure to U.S. large and mid-cap companies that have high degrees of pricing power. And pricing power is important. In fact, Warren Buffett said the single most important decision in evaluating a business is pricing power, right? So the idea is that, are they able to pass on the cost of inflation potentially, to consumers? Do they have a wide enough profit margin where if that margin starts to, diminish because of increase in the cost of raw materials or goods or any of those variable costs, having those high margins because of pricing power means that they might be able to, let's say, not thrive, but at least do better in a high inflation environment. So the Nasdaq U.S. Price Setters Index identifies these companies by looking at, certain metrics, right? High quality, high profitability, your strong brands, consistency over different time periods. So you can see these different 11 price setter data points that we look at to evaluate that if these companies have high, strong pricing power, earnings quality, earnings growth over the past 7 years, high operating margin over a 7-year time period, sales growth over a 3-year time period. So looking at a lot of different, data points and metrics over different time frames to find companies that have high pricing power. So this index is going to allocate to about 150 companies, U.S. large, U.S. mid. It's evaluated and rebalanced annually in March, and it uses a modified equal weighted, weighting methodology.
All right, Ben, and to wrap up here, tell us about index exposure and performance.
Yeah, it's interesting when you start to look at the constituents that make up this index today, you see that there is a healthy amount of industries that the industry has allocation, the index is on allocation too. So there's some parity at the top where you're not seeing it really tilted one way or the other, right? So if you're looking at industrials and healthcare, they're the two overweight sectors between 18 and 19%. We also see a healthy allocation to financials around 15% and technology around 13%. Where it's underweighted, you see base materials and utilities. And you do see some household names in this index. You see the likes of Home Depot, which was recently in the news because it was passing off the rising cost of lumber prices to consumers. Pool Corporation, Sherwin-Williams, Moody's Corporation, which I think Warren Buffett has talked about a lot as an example of a company that has pricing power. If you look at performance, right, I think we have to really look at a short-term time period here because this hasn't been, one of the perennial winners of the last few years, right? Because this is a quality-like index. It's not going to be really tilted towards growth, which was, of course, the story last year. But we really have seen this index begin to pick up over the last couple of months. In fact, it's up about 7.8% over the past 3 months when we really started to see this inflation narrative pick up. That's outpacing the S&P 500 and even outpacing the Nasdaq 100 right now. And so there is an ETF that tracks this index. That's the Principal Quality ETF, symbol is PSET. So for anyone interested in looking at kind of the ways to mitigate the risk of inflation or what companies may be able to thrive or perform better in an inflationary environment, this is an index, and the ETF that tracks it, provides a way of tracking and accessing this space.
All right, Ben, appreciate the insight as always. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks, and thanks for joining me. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.